Howdy everybody, welcome back to the next episode. Last time we set up LSP. First we set it up the manual way, we did it the hard way, and afterwards we installed LspInfo, which made our life just a bit easier. But if you remember from the last episode, I gave you some homework, which, was optional homework of course. However, it was good if you tried it. Specifically, in the last episode, I asked you to install ClangD globally on your machine. See if you can get the ClangD server working and get Neovim to recognize the ClangD server that's installed on your system. If you manage to pull it off, that's fantastic. You probably learned quite a bit in the process as well. For example, if you're on Windows, you probably started learning a thing or two about package management on Windows and how hellish it can be over there. But in this episode, we are going to automate and simplify things even further than we already have. Because today we're installing Mason. Mason.nvim is a plugin that manages the installation of LSP servers for us automatically, so you don't even have to do any installation for your system or anything like that. You basically just select the language servers that you're interested in, press install, and it just sets them up, and Neovim automatically recognizes them on your system no matter what operating system you're running under. So this has many upsides and many downsides. So it's important to weigh the two. If you've ever been on forums or on Reddit or any sort of Neovim related discussion place, there's always going to be two groups of people. One group of people is just going to be your average person that uses Neovim, and they don't really care about what's considered the correct way, quote unquote. So they will have Mason installed, they'll have all of the helper libraries for Mason installed as well, and they'll just be living a happy life. They'll have their LSPs working and whatnot. On the other side, you have the team of purists, which actually I belong to as well, who say that using Mason is not correct. You should not be using a package manager for Neovim specifically. What do I mean by that? When we use Mason, and I'm going to show you that in a minute, Mason is going to pull down the language servers into a location where only Neovim can see them. So that means if I install ClangD, the ClangD binary, the application, is going to be stored in a folder that realistically only Neovim is going to access. Now, if you only use Neovim, that's perfectly fine, and I really don't think you should listen to the purists. But if you're using many different editors, if every editor installs its own copy of ClangD, then that's a bit wasteful, isn't it? And that's where using your system package manager really shines. This second group of people manages their LSPs solely through the system package manager. This means that their system is the one that manages updates to the LSP, and also the LSP is accessible to any application that might have an LSP client built in. So watching this video is actually a decision for you right now. Do you, for the rest of time, want to manage your own LSP installations? Or do you want to have Neovim do it for you? I personally believe if you're a beginner, don't really worry about what that second group has to say. I feel like if you're just starting out, you shouldn't really worry about all of the nuances of what's correct, what's not. Just use the thing that actually works at the end of the day. So that brings us swiftly over to the mason.nvim GitHub page. It's a portable package manager for Neovim that runs everywhere Neovim runs. It installs and manages LSP servers, dApp servers, linters, and formatters. dApp servers, linters, and formatters are not something we're going to be covering in this video specifically. We're only interested in the LSP servers. So we're going to scroll down a bit here, and there's a link to the installation section. We are now 8 episodes into the series. So here's my challenge for you. Without looking at how I do it, try setting up mason.nvim. It's quite a simple thing. You add it to the list of your plugins, and then just make sure you're running the setup function where you should be. Remember, this tutorial series is supposed to teach you stuff, and it's not just supposed to be you blindly following along what I'm doing. So I do recommend you pause the video now, but if not, it's fine, I'll still show you. Under the installation section, we have the lazy.nvim snippet. Obviously, that's the thing we're interested in since we're using lazy as our plugin manager. Going to copy over the code block, then I'm going to move over into my config. In my plugins.lua file, I'm going to paste down a new declaration of a plugin, which is going to be mason.nvim, and I'll also create a callback with the Mason setup. If you pause the video and your code looks like this, or is similar to this, then you did a good job, well done. Now, if we exit Neovim and we re-enter Neovim, we're going to have mason.nvim installed for us. Sweet. So what changed? The thing that's most notable is the Mason command. There are a few of these Mason prefixed commands. We're mostly interested in the main Mason command. If you type out the command, hit enter, you are now greeted with a completely new menu. So this is mason.nvim. This is the heart of the project. So as I said, Mason is an installation tool for our LSPs. We're only interested in the LSPs in this episode. So you see there's a menu up here, and LSP is under menu number 2. So if you just press 2 on your keyboard, you are now going to only see LSP servers that are available for installation. So we installed ClangD locally in the last episode. So this time, let's try and install it through Mason instead. If I hit / to start searching, something really cool is going to happen. You're going to see that Mason now supplies a bunch of keywords for every single language server. So you don't really have to remember the names of the language servers themselves. As long as you know the language that you're installing the server for, you're good. For instance, Bash, I can just search for Bash and it's going to show me the Bash language server. We're interested in C++, so we're going to scroll down until we see ClangD. And then once you're hovering over it with your Neovim cursor, it's as simple as pressing I on your keyboard. Lowercase I is going to install it. It may take a while, depending on the speed of your internet. It's going to take varying amounts of time, especially since ClangD is a decently sized LSP, but you can see it already finished and ClangD is installed. You're probably expecting me to add something else now here, but no, I mean, this is it. You now have a working LSP server and we can try it. Just make sure that in your LSP config setup, you are setting up the actual language server itself. If you are free to, save and quit Neovim, enter a test.c file and create a syntax error or something, and you can see you are getting proper LSP completions. So I can, create a main function, I can do printf, and it's telling me too few arguments. So we now have a fully working LSP installation. What I encourage that you do now is just let your imagination run wild. Install all of the LSP servers that you will be using personally in your day-to-day programming life. Search for them using / and install all of them. Install anything that you're really going to use. Just remember one thing. Once you install a language server, for example, Lua language server, if I install that, I need to be sure that I set that up using LspInfo. Another example would, for example, be Rust Analyzer. So I can get Rust Analyzer installed on my system. Then I simply have to save and quit and copy this line over and change ClangD to Rust Analyzer. Then I'm free to enter any sort of Rust project that I might have, and Rust Analyzer is going to kick in and is going to analyze my code. That's super, super sweet. Now, there are actually 3 warnings that I'm going to have to give you right now. First of all, you're probably going to get an error if you try to set up the Lua language server. It's a very small detail, we'll get into it in just a minute. The second thing is, there might be cases where your LSP for some reason is not launching whatsoever. Usually, under 90% of cases, this is because the LSP server was not able to recognize the root directory of your project. You might recall from the last episode, we actually talked about root directories and we set one up ourselves. When we were manually setting up ClangD, we had to provide some sort of root. And we simply provided that as the current working directory. But as I said, LspInfo has very specialized root detection mechanisms for each individual language. In some languages, it's very, very easy to detect the root of a project. For example, in Rust projects, every Rust project is going to have a cargo.toml file somewhere. So it's very easy for nvim LspInfo to find that file and just mark the directory that that file resides in as the root of your project. But in other programming languages, which might be more esoteric or that might not have such a well built out ecosystem, it might be quite tricky to detect the root. If you feel like the LSP is unable to detect the root directory, and I'll show you how to check that in a minute, the best thing that you can do is you can initialize an empty Git repository in the directory that you're in. If you don't already have a Git repo there, simply run the git init command in the directory where your source files are, and LspInfo is going to fall back to looking for a Git repository if it can. It's always a good safeguard to have in case, it can't locate the root directory for some reason. It's just going to look for the Git repo instead. Now, how do you actually check whether the LSP is working and why it's not working in case it's bugged? Let's move back over into a test.c file where I'm just going to create an empty main function. What you can run in your editor instance is a command called LspInfo. If you hit enter on that, it's going to show you a window and it's going to display all of the LSPs that are working under the current buffer that you're in. So you see there is one client attached to the current buffer I'm in. The detected file type of the buffer is C, which is good because, we're in a test.c file, so it properly detected. And the client itself is ClangD. So this tells us a bunch of things right out of the gate. First of all, it tells us that the LSP server is working because it's attached to the buffer. It also shows us the file types that this LSP is going to launch in, which I think is very nice. The next thing that you'll be looking for is this command. This command is a path to the LSP server itself. You can see that inside of your .local/share, there's also an nvim directory /mason/bin in which all of the LSP servers are installed. You'll notice I have nvim.tutorial here. Don't worry about that. That's because, I'm making a tutorial. What you will see here is .local/share/nvim/mason and so on and so forth. This, however, is the star of the show, and if you want to see if your LSP server has located a root directory in the first place, this is what you'll be looking for. Now in this case, it's saying it's running in single file mode. The LSP specification allows for certain servers, well, not certain, it allows for any LSP server to run in a single file mode. Now, this is on a per LSP basis, so not every server is going to support running in single file mode. Some will, some won't, so it's really a hit or miss. However, if something is wrong with the root directory detection, you will definitely see it here, so this is the place you should be looking in the LSP start command, and then in this section. To exit the window, simply press Q, and now we're back where we started. As I alluded to earlier, there is one minute detail that we missed and that we have to address. The error is with the Lua language server. What's wrong with it? I mean, it doesn't seem like there should be a mistake. After all, if I run Mason, we see that Lua language server is installed. So it might make sense to do lspconfig Lua language server .setup, right? It should work. Well, let's try it. We're going to quit. We're going to re-enter, and we get an error. Well, that's not good. It's telling us it cannot access the configuration for Lua language server. Okay, so we can infer from this error that Lua language server does not exist according to lspconfig. But why? This is because mason.nvim and lspconfig have different names for different LSP servers. This is where it gets confusing, because within mason.nvim, the language server is called a Lua language server. However, under lspconfig, the language server is known as Lua_ls. And if you save and quit and re-enter, you can see there are no more errors, right? And indeed, we even get Lua diagnostics now. So that kind of sucks, doesn't it? You can't really trust the name that you see in Mason. But there is a fix for this, and the fix is another plugin. And this is the last LSP related plugin that we'll be installing for a while. So put your seatbelts on and let's get cracking. So the name is mason-lspconfig.nvim. This is what it's called. It's an extension to Mason that makes it easier to use lspconfig with mason.nvim. And you see this issue explained directly in the README. You can see that in the introduction, it tells you that mason-lspconfig is capable of translating between lspconfig server names and mason.nvim package names. So this plugin is going to bridge the gap between lspconfig and Mason. Mason-lspconfig is going to read the installed servers that you have from Mason, and then it's going to shell out to lspconfig and it's going to just perform the setup automatically for you. All of the plugins start talking with each other at this point, and it's really satisfying to see. So you already know the drill by now. In our configuration, I have created an entry for mason-lspconfig, and then in the configuration function, I'm simply calling the mason-lspconfig.setup. I know to do this because if you scroll down in the setup section, we are being told to set up mason-lspconfig. However, this is why you should always pay attention to the readmes. This isn't the only thing that we have to do in order to get mason-lspconfig to work. At the very top, you can also see that it's important that you set up the plugins in the following order. First, we need to load Mason, then we need to load mason-lspconfig, and afterwards we need to load lspconfig itself. So in this case, order matters. That's a bit concerning, isn't it? Because we don't really have any way within Lazy to specify order. We haven't done this before. Currently what we're doing is we're simply specifying a list of plugins, which is all of this stuff, and we don't really care in which order stuff gets loaded. We only realistically care that it gets loaded in the first place. Thankfully, Lazy has a key that allows us to do this. What we can do is we can ignore this third setup step, because as I said earlier, we are going to be removing this section from nvim lspconfig, because we're going to have mason-lspconfig.nvim set up all of the servers for us automatically. So we don't really care about the loading order here, because there is going to be no loading in the first place. So we can ignore the third step completely and instead focus on making sure that mason.nvim runs before mason-lspconfig.nvim does. Doing this is super simple. I'm just going to go down to where I have mason-lspconfig.nvim, and below it, I'm going to specify a dependencies key. Now, dependencies key tells Lazy to load a specific set of plugins before this plugin actually loads. So in between these curly brackets, in between the table, we are going to put in the name of our plugin. Now, this can be the full name. It can be literally this string copy pasted, or it can just be the end of the name. So I can just do mason.nvim. So now what's going to happen is Every time you set up your configuration elsewhere, Lazy is going to make sure that Mason is installed first, and only then is mason-lspconfig installed afterwards. If you want to be very, very rigorous, you could also make lspconfig a dependency of mason-lspconfig, although the docs don't actually tell us that, and there's no reason to overcomplicate stuff if we don't really have to. Not only is dependencies important during the installation process, it's also important during the startup process. So when we run Neovim for the first time, because Mason is a dependency of mason-lspconfig, the config function for this plugin is going to run first. And only then is the config function going to run for mason-lspconfig. Sometimes, just sometimes, in the Neovim ecosystem, it's important to make sure the plugins load in a very specific order, and we can achieve that using this dependencies key. Okay, now that we have this, we can save and quit. We can re-enter Neovim and have mason-lspconfig be installed onto our machine. Now let's move on to the second step, which is the automatic setup of our LSPs. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to completely delete this config function over here. Just going to highlight all of it, delete it. And now if I save and quit and re-enter Neovim, you'll see I don't get any diagnostics from the Lua language server. And that's fine, because now we're going to bring it back thanks to mason-lspconfig. So over on the README, you see there is a section called automatic server setup. And you can read this if you want, but what we're going to do is we are going to consult the help page itself. If you're a newcomer, you may or may not know this, but plugins can also expose their own help pages. Help pages aren't just limited to Neovim itself. So whenever you install a plugin, try searching for it in the help pages. Maybe you'll find some sort of really interesting information that will allow you to deeper customize the plugin that you're dealing with. So I'm just going to copy this and of course paste it into the command line over here, hit enter, and now we are taken to the page for Mason Dynamic Server Setup. Now according to this entry, we are supposed to invoke a function called setup handlers. And this function is going to do all of the heavy lifting and is going to make sure that all of our LSP servers are set up for us. Now you'll see this function takes in a table. It's just that the brackets are dropped. Recall a few episodes ago, I told you that you can drop brackets in Lua. And you'll see it takes in a bunch of parameters that we might want to tweak in the future. The first entry, without any sort of key, will be the default handler. Now there is actually a bit of a misleading segment in here. And when I first set up this plugin on my own, I did fall into this trap. Here it says this is the default handler and so it's optional. Now what I assumed this means is that I can invoke setup handlers with an empty table and that everything would work. But they are lying to you here. Unfortunately, with a bit of debugging, I eventually figured out that you do actually have to supply this callback into the function. Recall, this is also a throwback to callbacks, which I explained, I believe, all the way back in episode 2. This is simply a callback, which is going to contain some code, and this code is going to run every time mason-lspconfig wants to set up some sort of server. And you can see it's going to execute this function with a server name parameter, which we can then pass into lspconfig and in turn set up all of our LSPs. Then down at the bottom here, in case you want to do any specific overrides for individual LSPs, you can also do that here by supplying the name of the LSP, a function, and then your own custom code. So you can see this is quite expressive. Instead of having to do all of our stuff through nvim lspconfig, we now have everything centralized and packaged into this little helper plugin over here. Enough yapping, let's just copy over this section. And then right below the mason-lspconfig.setup function, I'm going to paste in the setup handlers. I'm going to remove the comments because we don't really need the comments, we're professionals. I'm also going to remove the Rust analyzer section because we're not going to be doing any specific overrides on our own yet. And then I'm going to add the brackets over here and also the brackets over here because I just prefer my stuff to have brackets. And this is what we're left with. So now every time Neovim boots up, first it's going to launch mason.nvim. Then we are going to require mason-lspconfig setup function, and that's going to read all of the data from Mason and is going to pull the list of LSPs that we have installed on our system. And then this function is going to perform the actual setup process, which is going to shell out to lspconfig. And then finally, at the end of all of that, we are going to have a fully automatic LSP setup within Neovim. So now we can save and quit, we can re-enter, and well, there you go. You might recall I installed the Lua language server. If you haven't, just head over to Mason, search for Lua language server, hit I to install it, and now you can see the Lua language server is working. So now whenever you want to install some sort of LSP for any language, you simply launch the Mason UI, search for the thing that you're interested in, for example, Zig, install the Zig language server, and now you're done. You can now enter any sort of Zig project and you're going to get proper completions, proper error messages, and also stuff like go-to-definition, rename, and other niceties that you would get from LSP. So this concludes the mini-series on LSP. We started off very bare bones, setting up an individual LSP server, understanding what that is. Then we moved on to the next level of bootstrapping, setting up LspConfig, which does some of the heavy lifting for configuration. And then afterwards, we automated the installation process by installing mason-lspconfig.nvim. And then in the very end, we tied together the installation and setup process into one big thing, thanks to mason-lspconfig.nvim. And now we don't need to do any sort of manual setup ourselves. We simply select the server that we're interested in, and the rest is completely magical. Looking forward to the next episode. If there isn't anything more pressing, I would like to move on to completions, specifically nvim CMP, and that's going to allow us to use the LSP servers that we installed in this mini-series to provide intelligent code completions like you would get in something like VS Code. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you had a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next episode. Ciao!